Hi everyone, this is Travels with an Archaeologist. I'm the Archaeologist, now let's get into the travels. Today, we're back in Tunisia, in the town of El Jem. El Jem itself is a small outpost on the edge of the Sahara and on the edge of the Roman Empire, but it's here we find one of the most impressive Roman ruins in the world, the Amphitheater. So in this episode, I'm not talking about this particular amphitheater. I mean, I am, but I'm not. See, the Romans had a standardized building system, so as we go through this, keep in mind that you can apply it to almost any amphitheater in the world. But what is an amphitheater? Well, that should be obvious, shouldn't it? Well, not really. Is this an amphitheater? How about this one? This one? No, they weren't. Roman amphitheaters are fully circular, often freestanding monumental structures, and they were used for battle reenactments, executions, and perhaps most famously, gladiatorial combat. Going to watch a spectacle in an amphitheater was by far the most popular pastime in the Roman world, and you can see from this view up above that you'd have a good view from just about anywhere, a lot like our modern sports arenas. Because it is our modern sports arena, except, with less corporate sponsorships and more lions. No, real lions. They kept real lions at these amphitheaters. Speaking of which. So where I'm standing now, you expect me to say this is where they kept the lions? Oh God, no, hope not. This is where the audience would have entered. No, this is where they kept the lions. That would have been a pretty good cutaway joke if it had actually been open, right? Yeah, unfortunately, it is closed and it's probably for a reason. Fortunately, I've been to a lot of these amphitheaters, so let me supplement the rest of this video with pictures from underneath the amphitheater in Naples. This section, below the amphitheater in Naples, is almost as extensive as the upper levels. You can see there were 2 floors of cells for animals, prisoners, and gladiators. Not all of these rooms would have been used in a negative context, but all of them were used in preparation for what was going on up above. As the amphitheater was so important to Roman life and culture, this meant that city life centered around it and every city needed one, which means they were often in or near the city center, often near the forums, and in the middle of public life. Where I'm standing now is called the vomitorium. Is that not what you're thinking of when you hear the term vomitorium? Well, it's called that because people would go through there and then they'd branch out a bit like vomit. But if you didn't think of that when you thought of vomitorium, you're not alone. Unfortunately, a lot of pop culture references hear the term vomit and believe it has something to do with eating. In fact, it has something to do with just a dirty joke for an entryway. And once you got into this amphitheater, where you sat depended on your social status. Now, if you were an emperor or one of his associates, you'd sit in this special spectator box. If you were a high-status official, such as a praetor, a special guest, or a member of a religious order, including the Vestal Virgins, you'd sit opposite the emperor. If you were a senator or an equestrian, you'd get to sit on the first tier nearest the stadium. If you were a patrician, from a rich family or a noble lineage, you'd get the second tier just above the senators. But more likely, you'd be a commoner or a plebeian, and you'd get a seat with a view that looked something like this. This is by no means a bad view. And these games were open to everyone, even slaves could come and watch the spectacle. Your wealth and standing determined how close you were to the action, not whether or not you could see it. Now officially, if you're a woman, you're actually sitting in the 4th or highest tier of the amphitheater. In reality, however, it seems that this was for the unaccompanied women, with those going as a member of a man's house allowed to take a seat with the man in some circumstances. In fact, women did have more of a role in amphitheaters than is usually discussed. Much like the vomitorium, rumors of a woman's role in Rome have been distorted by Western media either positively or negatively. There's even evidence of female gladiators fighting. Now imagine being the star of the show, standing in this arena and finding all these people staring down at you, cheering for the blood that was about to be shed, be it yours or your opponent's. They really did not care which. Now for some shows, you did enter through this large entrance, but in most fights you could be raised up to the floor on an elevator, or you could enter through one of these doors on the side. Either way, your senses would be overwhelmed by more than just the crowd. Right, so where I am now is in the inner ring of the arena. And I'm filming this in darkness because it's important for you to get a sense of context how this was. You can kind of think of this as a preparing ground. This is where you'd put your people and your animals before they came out into the arena to start fighting to the death. And they came through this dark passage until, eventually, you reached the audience in broad daylight. Of course, it wasn't always gladiators or public execution. The amphitheater was used for a wide range of entertainment and public spectacle. They were even known to flood the Colosseum with water to recreate a few naval battles. This meant that most amphitheaters have some really impressive engineering, including El Gem, which has this wide strip running down the middle. Sadly, not visible on the day I went, as you can see from all my other footage. This was raised up to air out the basement. And again, this architecture is common to most other amphitheaters. By all regards, I didn't have to do this video at El Gem. As spoiled as it sounds, I've been to more than enough amphitheaters that I really was going to just pass El Gem by. So why is El Gem in particular anything special? Well, for one thing, El Gem is original. The relative decline in population of the town and the isolation in the desert allowed it to survive, unlike the Colosseum, which was looted for building materials in later eras. For another, El Gem was big. And I do mean big. If you ever do come to the El Gem, they'll tell you it's the largest amphitheater outside of Italy. Is that true? It's a fair question. A lot of places claim to have the third largest amphitheater in the Roman world. Well, in El Gem's case, this might actually be true. But it also might not be. As it turns out, it's actually really, really hard to find solid statistical data on the size of Roman amphitheaters. Because they have benches rather than seats, how many people it can seat is very much a guess. And in that regard, El Gem does have some competition. In terms of physical size, El Gem actually is the tallest in the empire from ground to roof. But this is made up for by the fact that it doesn't have much of a basement, so don't read too much into it. In terms of area, it has a bit of competition. Still, by every metric I found, El Gem could seat about 30 to 35, even up to 40,000 people, which certainly makes it a contender for the third biggest in the empire. But this is not definite. By the same metrics, the amphitheaters in Verona and Nimes were similar in size, and there seems to be no set standard on which metrics were used to calculate capacity. It's also important to note that true Roman amphitheaters are rarer than they might seem, and sometimes a converted theater or circus could function as an amphitheater. Even so, there were well over 200 amphitheaters across the Roman Empire, and El Gem does indeed consistently rank as among the biggest of them. But again, there seems to be no actual objective data collected on this particular metric from any one solid source. So by any measure, El Gem was large. And it's fair to ask, what's one of the biggest amphitheaters in the Roman Empire doing here in the middle of the Tunisian desert? Now, even if this was bigger in the past, which it certainly was, why put it here? Why not have it in Alexandria, Carthage? Well, part of it comes down to the time it was built in. This amphitheater was completed around 238 CE, and that was a very interesting time for Rome and for Africa. See, in the 3rd century, a lot of the Roman emperors had actually come from Africa. The founder of the Severan dynasty, Septimius Severus, was born in Leptis Magna in neighboring Libya. Africa got some pretty huge developments in the 3rd century as a result of this, with some of Africa's most impressive remains dating to this Severan time period. Africa was highly important in the 3rd century as well, as the trade links between African nomads and the empire was expanding, and thanks to investments in border garrisons, raids were going down, allowing the population to rise and live in relative stability. It was also much more fertile back then. Tunisia itself was one of the breadbaskets of Rome, along with Egypt, supplying a massive amount of grain to the empire, and El Gem itself was home of a thriving olive oil industry. Carthage was among the largest cities in the empire. But more than that, the 3rd century also allowed Africa to thrive through major crisis. Following the death of the Severan emperors, the empire fell into a period of political turmoil. Emperors arose and were deposed frequently by officials and military leaders. These emperors often died in civil strife, and Africa became a reliable base from which to conduct yourself. Carthage even became the seat of power for more than a few of them, among them the Gordians, who reigned from 238 to 245. Now you're probably saying, fair enough, archaeologist, you've convinced me. Africa was pretty important in the 3rd century, but you still haven't explained why El Gem in particular. After all, the Severans were from Leptis Magna, why not put it in Leptis Magna? Or why not put it in Carthage, where the Gordians are from? Well, back then, this town was called Thysdrus, which was a large city for trade between the desert nomads and the empire. But in 238, the town became the site of a massive revolt, as the army assassinated an imperial procurator of the treasury and named their leader, the proconsul of Africa, a man named Gordianus, emperor. The revolt was brutally put down, with Thysdrus being burned to the ground, but Gordian III would rule in his own right after his grandfather and father had both died in this brutally putty-downy thing. He then put the amphitheater here in the town which had propelled his family to the throne. At least this is the most popular idea for El Gem's construction. However, as the amphitheater lacks proper inscriptions or any real dates, some have suggested that the amphitheater was already here. Thysdrus was an important city in its own right, acting as the major point of contact between nomadic tribes and the cities of the Tunisian coast. It had a large and thriving olive industry, and by this point rivaled Hadrumetum in size. The most popular narrative says that Gordian I was already working on an amphitheater for this town as early as 230, which is the city where he was living in. But others claim that the amphitheater might be as old as the end of the 2nd century. However, excavations have shown that even if it existed before this point, the Gordians enlarged it to these massive proportions. But the big question is, with the empire in the grips of the crisis of the 3rd century, where did they get the money to build this amphitheater? Well, the curious thing is, this crisis was one of politics and military, not actually one of bureaucracy. See, although the emperors were dropping like flies and the armies were fighting each other, the average Roman citizen wouldn't have noticed much. It's actually quite similar to today's world. No matter how unstable and fractured our politics get, taxes are still paid, bureaucrats are still working, and citizens, with a handful of exceptions, are relatively safe as they are kept under a stable environment. This isn't to say that there were no consequences, or that the ordinary Roman didn't feel some kind of economic pinch or slowdown. I mean, we feel that in today's world when our politics get really unstable. It's just more that life was able to go on. And as a breadbasket of the empire, Africa was a rich province that had a lot of money. And amphitheaters were one thing you really wanted to invest in. Yet, despite the investment in this amphitheater, the town declined after its completion, mostly due to the sack of the city by rival emperors, but partially because the empire really was starting to feel the squeeze of the crisis of the 3rd century. By the time Africa recovered, Thysdrus was back to being a backwater town, and the massive amphitheater has remained standing there, a monument to what was once the 2nd largest city in Roman Tunisia, the birthplace of an imperial dynasty, no matter how short-lived, and it still remains there as a memory to what this town would have looked like in the old days of the empire, to be part of these cheering crowds looking at one of Rome's most popular pastimes. That's all I have to say on El Gem. Thanks for listening to it. Again, please do remember to like this video and subscribe to my channel, and feel free to leave a comment if you have an idea of what you want me to cover in a future video. Anyway, until next time, I'm the Archaeologist, and this has been The Travels.